Welcome back to Kingdom Over Coffee. This is Britt Mooney again, and this is episode 101. And I have a very special episode for you today. I have the opportunity over the next month or two to talk to some filmmakers. When I was at NRB, they asked me if I wanted to be part of the press, and I said sure. And that allowed me to have some opportunities to talk to some interesting people, and which you've already heard some of on some of the previous episodes up until this point. And some of those people were filmmakers, and I am very interested in the arts and filmmaking in general. So I was very interested to talk to some of these people and have some conversations about movies, about film. And as I said in the last episode, that one of the ways that we preach the gospel is through media and through film. That's how we communicate. We tell stories, and Jesus told stories. And of course, the gospels are stories, right? Narratives recounting what Jesus did and what people around him did. And there's a lot of history throughout the Bible. And my point is that this is a great way to get the message across. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of a review of the movie quickly here, kind of telling you what it's about and my thoughts on it. And then I have a special interview with Christopher Zaluski. He is the director and the filmmaker for Theirs is the Kingdom. And that's the movie that we're talking about today. Theirs is the Kingdom. It's about an hour long. It's a documentary, and you can find it on Amazon Prime, Apple TV, any of the streaming services where you can rent something on demand sort of thing. And it's, like I said, it's about an hour long, and it goes through the story of this church called Haywood Street Church, where the pastor there, Brian Combs, decided that he wanted to have a fresco done in his church. And of course, it made the news in the area. It's Asheville, North Carolina. It made the news in the area because he was looking for grants and money to raise to help him to do this, because it was going to cost about $250,000. Now, this is all connected to the ministry of Haywood Street, which a lot of it is to reach out to the broken and the hurting and the addicted and the homeless. And if you have been paying attention on this podcast, this may be the first time you've listened to this podcast, but that's a big part of the ministry that I'm a part of. In the church planting network that I'm a part of, the Phoenix community of Atlanta, the foundation of planting our churches is to try to reach out to people that other people don't reach out to, and trying to create those bridges, as it were, through whatever means that we can, so we can express the truth of who Jesus is and God's love and the gospel and salvation and discipleship and all of those things that are transformative. And yet maybe sometimes people aren't treated with dignity so that we can really have those conversations. So this movie really spoke to me. And obviously, I loved the title of the movie, Theirs is the Kingdom. It's taken from the Gospel of Matthew. So I wanted to kind of look through this movie and talk about it for just a few minutes here, because I really connected with Brian Combs, at least what he was saying in the film. Because at one point in the film, he says that his church and the ministries that they have, that he was trying to connect with the people that were kicked out of other homeless ministries, right? He wanted to talk to those people, someone that had been banned from other homeless shelters. And man, that's just the heart of Jesus. And I love that. And so part of this fresco and part of the, I don't know if you want to call it controversy, it's kind of a controversy in the film, is that people were looking at this project saying, well, why should we give so much money for an art project? That's $250,000. Like, couldn't you use that money to feed and house and clothe and do all of these sort of utilitarian things? And Brian makes the point that life is more than that. And as we get into in the interview here in a second, that's what Jesus says, right? Life is more than food and clothing. Like, there's something bigger than that. And that's part of the gift of the gospel and what Jesus is talking about in Matthew chapter 6 in the Sermon on the Mount, where he's saying, hey, God has your needs taken care of. He's got your survival taken care of. Your life is about more than that. And so he'll take care of your needs so that you can get involved in purpose and in the kingdom, basically. That's the term it used in the scripture, but it's about purpose. It's about doing something meaningful. So they had to kind of fight through some things, and along the way got in touch with Zaluski here, who made the documentary, going through the whole process. Now, Christopher Holt is the lead artist in charge of making this fresco. Now, if you don't know what a fresco is, you're really going to have to watch the movie, because it does a fascinating job going through the process of this sort of Renaissance era art model and medium that was used hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And it's all about plaster, and it's not really a painting. And it's really cool. And I really appreciated that. So it goes through that process of starting with the sketches and the design, and then just kind of building from there, kind of reclaiming and redeeming this old medium of art, which is very thematic of the whole film and the ministry of going into these people's lives and redeeming these lives that have been lost to homelessness or addiction, or both, or all sorts of issues. One person in the film has AIDS and another has cancer. So there's all sorts of different broken people, quote unquote, whose lives were redeemed through relationship and love. And so I dig all of that. And I also love the inclusion of the arts. As I've said before, I really enjoyed how they made the point that these people's stories should be immortalized. So this fresco that they decided to do in the church wasn't like Jesus on a cross. It wasn't what we would consider very traditional or neo-traditional religious art. Instead, they used some different people in their community that had been transformed and that had been a part of their community for a long time. They'd been around for about 10 years. And they decided to use them as examples of people from the Beatitudes. And that's why the movie is called Theirs is the Kingdom, which we get into in the interview here in a couple of minutes. But as we look at it, it was really interesting to me because, again, if you've been around me and if you've been around our church at all that I'm a part of, we are huge on people telling their stories and asking people their stories. And so, again, I really connected with that in this movie, that they really dug into people's stories. And so not only are they telling the stories in the film, but what they're trying to say is that these people who may be forgotten by the world, may be forgotten by the community, may be almost dismissed as not that important, that their stories are important, are just as important as anyone else's. And so to dignify that, they're immortalizing their story in this fresco. And I love the dignity of that. I keep saying all that I love about it. And finally, I think the big message here of this movie, and why I would suggest that people watch it, is that it really shows the transformation of love, of radical acceptance and generosity and love. And that's really who Jesus is. And that faith in action changes people's hearts and lives. I believe very strongly in right theology and correct doctrine. I think that's important, and I think that we should stand for correct doctrine and right theology. But you know what is part of that correct doctrine is that our faith doesn't mean anything if we're not putting it into action. And that's something that the director Zaluski talks about. That was a transformative moment for him. And I think it's a transformative moment for a lot of people, because we can speak truth, and we should use words all the time, because faith comes by hearing. So please hear me correctly. I'm not saying we shouldn't use words, but what our world needs to see at the same time is a life lived in faith. They need to see that generosity. They need to see with their eyes that we are living what we believe. And I think all too often I'm not going to say dismiss that, but we don't find that as important as we should sometimes. And I know a lot of churches that do a lot of amazing things in the community. So I don't think this is a blanket statement about all Christianity or evangelicalism or anything like that. But this movie does a great job of saying that and showing us that we should continue to, or if we're not already, get involved in putting our faith into action by reaching out to those who are hopeless and giving them hope. More than once in the film, you hear, or it's seen in the film, one of the models, one of the people that they are placing within the fresco, as they interview them, they say, I showed up for a meal, because Haywood Street provides meals for the hungry. And they said, well, I showed up for a meal and I was loved in the process. And I just thought that was a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I really saw that as something that we need to remember, that people might show up for a free meal, but what they're really looking for, what they really need, is love. They need family. They need someone to reach out to them and hear their story. And I'm not going to say too much more, because we talk a lot about it in the upcoming interview, as I keep plugging it. I was really honored to talk to the director. And just as I close about the film, I did not agree with every detail of doctrine and theology that was stated in the movie. And yet, I believe that the central message of the film, loving people, giving people dignity, telling their stories, using art to connect people to truth and the needs of people, and faith in action. I think those central messages that are in the whole movie, I absolutely believe in those things, and I absolutely believe that the church can do a better job. And one of the things that we're supposed to do when we gather together, and that's one of the things that happens on this podcast, is we are gathering, even though we're not in the same physical space, we're on the same digital space. We're supposed to stir one another up to love and good works. And I believe that this film does that in a very healthy and a very loving way. So, without any further ado, here is the interview that I had with the director, Christopher Zaluski. Like, share, and all that with the podcast here in this episode, and check out the show notes for more links on the movie and the church and other ways that you can find out more information. All right? Peace out. All right. Well, I am joined here today by Christopher Zaluski, or did I say it right? I didn't say it right.
Zaluski. It's totally
Zaluski. I didn't say it right. I was like, man, I just said it and then I didn't say it right.
That's all
Zaluski.
Right.
And I watched the movie, Theirs is the Kingdom, or the film, the documentary. And I've done a little review on it, but I wanted to kind of explore some of the themes of the movie with the guy who made the movie, the filmmaker. Is that what you would call yourself, the filmmaker?
Yeah, sure. I'll go with that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
So Christopher, but as we get started, why don't you give people just a little bit of your background? Who are you? Where do you live?
Sure.
What's kind of your background in film or the arts or whatever?
Yeah. Yeah. So first off, thank you for having me. I appreciate the ability to talk about the project. But so I'm born and raised in Northeast Ohio, in Canton, Ohio. If you have any football fans out there, close to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and I kind of stumbled into this documentary film thing accidentally. I always wanted to be a newspaper reporter. I went to Appalachian State in Boone, North Carolina, and I was a journalism major there. And I actually was a newspaper reporter after I graduated. I worked for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and also the Roanoke Times in Roanoke, Virginia. And as I was in that world, because I was younger, they thought, oh, this is a young kid. He could shoot video and do internet stuff and write and do all this. And so they pushed me toward this position that was called a multimedia producer, which basically meant I was still doing traditional reporting, but doing it through maybe newer methods, video, interactive graphics, whatever it might be. And I got into video and I really enjoyed it. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. And I was fortunate at the time working for the Roanoke Times, which was a small enough paper that they gave me the flexibility to try to do a 15-minute documentary, and it would go on their website, which was really cool. In hindsight, I didn't realize how lucky I was, but that's ultimately what happened. It kind of snowballed from there. And I ended up going to Wake Forest to get my master's degree in documentary film. And that was in 2010. And so I've been in this world now for about 12 years, but I did not come to it as a film person or, I want to be a director or a cinematographer, whatever it might be. I came into it much more as a journalist and storyteller.
Yeah. Was that the element that really attracted you, the storytelling, like trying to find, even as a journalist, was that what attracted you, trying to find those interesting stories and tell those stories?
Yeah. I love talking to people. I love hearing people's stories. I'm an only child, so I always joke that like I need other people to energize me, and I was always like that growing up too, like just talking to strangers, and so I think that that's a big part of it. And so for me, I love the process of creating documentaries. I love calling people out of the blue and pitching them ideas. I love filming. I love editing. I love the whole process of it. I really do. And so, yeah, it's a process of discovery. But storytelling is really what drives it for me.
Yeah. I don't know if this is absolutely true, but as a creative, I do think you have to learn to love the process if you're going to be good at it. As much as it is hard work, you kind of have to love the process too, because or else I think that's why people quit. I'm not going to say that's a general statement about everybody, but that's kind of been my experience,
Yeah, I agree. So one of the storytelling gurus, I guess I would say, is Ira Glass, who's a podcast host for This American Life and has been, kind of on the forefront for a long time with audio storytelling. And he talks about the idea of being attracted to a field because you have good taste, like understanding what's good and you're not good yet. You have to work through to become the storyteller that you hope to become. So I agree with you. I think that you have to fall in love with the process.
Yeah. So how many films did you do roughly before you got involved in Theirs is the Kingdom?
Theirs is the Kingdom was my third real project. It is my feature-length debut, though. So I did one in 2012 about station wagons called Wagon Masters, and that was a 38-minute film, which is considered a short. I did another film in 2016, 2017 about a young couple who was building a home out of a shipping container. That film is called Shipping Home, and that was a shorter film. That was like 23 minutes. And so this one was my first feature-length, and I started work on this in late 2017, early 2018. So it's really kind of been my creative focus for the last 4 years.
Wow. Now, those other shorter films, what's the cutoff for a short film? Like 40 minutes? Yeah, I was about to say
it's probably it's a 40-minute cutoff. Yeah. So like at the Oscars, when they nominate, best short film, it's everything under 40. So you'll have like a 39-minute film that wins it or something like that. But yeah.
Now, did you get those on other platforms, streaming and stuff like that too? Did you have experience with that side of it already?
I did, certainly with Wagon Masters, that got some PBS distribution, and it's still on Amazon, and Amazon's the big one it's still on. But the world has changed so much with streaming services and everything, but just streaming services since 2012, that the experience of what I did with that film, it was a lot different. Theirs is the Kingdom was much more of a learning experience about the streaming landscape and all of that, because it is really a lot more booming now than it was in 2020.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's like, I hear about a new streaming service every week. It's like, oh, here's another one. And, and
another one shuts down too.
Another one shuts down and
constant. Yeah.
Yeah. So what drew you to this project? How did you hear about it? What's the story there? Like, how did you get involved in this particular project?
Yeah. So that second film I mentioned about the shipping container, the one of the main subjects of that film called me up and told me about this fresco that they were trying to paint in the sanctuary of this church in Asheville. I was living in Asheville at the time that I started working on this. And she kind of pitched it because there was this funding controversy surrounding the fresco.
Right.
And I thought, well, okay, I want to see what this whole thing's about. And so I went to the church. I was somewhat familiar with Haywood Street. I certainly was not a member of the church, but I was familiar with the church because of everything that we'll get into, I'm sure, about what it's doing with the homeless community in Asheville. And I went and I heard the pastor, Brian Combs, talk about what the fresco meant to him and what he thought it meant to the church. And within 10 minutes, I was immediately hooked. I mean, I thought that what he was saying was so powerful. And so the funding controversy is just a snippet of the film, but it's a much bigger film about the theology of Haywood Street, about the models who are being painted and depicted in the fresco, and about the art process and kind of carrying on this ancient technique that really isn't practiced all that much. Yeah.
Yeah. I think all of those elements are really amazing. And I appreciated the structure that you did. I don't know how much of the film and the structure and the choices that you made, how much of it was you and how much did you kind of check in with Brian and, throughout that process, just kind of the details.
Yeah. I mean, any film goes through a lot of iterations. I'm sure with screenwriting and things like that as well.
Sure.
Like you're constantly working on it in one form or another. I certainly wanted to keep Brian in the loop with showing him versions of the film, but it has to get to a point before I show it to somebody. You know what I mean? Like I'm not going to show somebody a real rough cut. There are people and friends and editors that I work with that I usually use for those types of cuts, where I say like, you understand this is a rough cut, and they do. People who don't work in video editing may not understand. If I send them a really rough cut, they think like, oh man, this thing's never going to get done. So one funny thing though, about the editing process, the very last shoot for the film, which is actually the very last scene in the film, it takes place at the North Carolina Museum of Art. It was March 5th, 2020. So 4 days later, like everything shut down. And so I edited the film in a vacuum. I mean, in multiple vacuums. It was layers upon layers of vacuums. And so I really felt like, the summer of 2020, and that was really when we were doing the heavy editing. It was kind of wild, but I was trying to show it to enough people, and it went through a number of iterations. But I certainly folded Brian in to make sure, like, hey, I'm telling a story about a community that I feel honored to have been allowed to be, brought into and tell this story, but certainly I'm telling it as an outsider. So I want to make sure that I'm not, missing something or conveying it, differently than what it should be conveyed as. And so certainly folded in Brian, Christopher, the artist, same thing, because I just wanted to make sure that I was telling a story that they would also be excited about and be supportive of.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you have like a team that you always work with, or do you have like a group of people or a network of people that you kind of pull from, or did you have to find a lot of those elements, like, or did you do a lot of it yourself? Maybe, I don't know.
I did do a lot of it myself. This was actually the first film project that I've worked on. Even in addition to the two I mentioned earlier, I've done a lot of like commercial nonprofit videos. This was the first one I've worked on where I didn't have my co-director. Everything I've been working on, it's usually me and this other guy, and he's based in Michigan, and he started working on a project and I started working on another one. And so it's kind of funny that he's in the credits as like story consultant, but I say that because I did a lot more of the work in this project than I typically would have. I have a good friend in Atlanta actually helped me out with a lot of the editing work or some of the assistant editing work. But I filmed 97% of this, and I edited probably 85% of it. And so most of the hands-on work was me. So and that's sometimes, what you have to do for a number of reasons. Budgeting, funding. In this case, COVID was a big reason for that.
Right. Yeah.
And so I kind of got sucked into the project. But the other side of that was, man, it really helped me get through 2020, to be totally honest with you. It was like this weird silver lining where I would, right here, this is the basement of my house, and I would edit right here. And it was like this weird world within a world that I could kind of escape to. And so I really looked forward to it, and it was an enjoyable process. And so I did a lot more work probably for that reason too.
Wow. Now, was in your previous projects, was that digital? I'm assuming this was mostly digital.
Oh yeah.
Footage.
Yeah.
And what about like in 2012? Was that digital as well?
It wasn't as high quality. I think like in 2012, it probably would have been 720. If you're familiar, like that would have been a little lower resolution. And actually in that film, we did work a little bit with film because there's like this Americana nostalgia feel to it. And so we do work a little bit with film, but no, I've pretty much only worked in digital. Okay. I know filmmakers who like will try to film things with film and that's try to get that aesthetic. Again, I think it speaks more to, like, I've been more interested in this from like a journalism storytelling background. So when it starts getting like that, I just don't know if it's worth the money, to be honest with you. So I haven't really messed with that too much.
Well, and I would assume that using the digital medium more would help you during COVID to share with other people and kind of get feedback, like you're saying, even as selective as you were, get some of that feedback that you were looking for with rough cuts and stuff like that, or with Brian or Christopher Holt or whoever. Yeah. It makes it a lot easier to share it. It makes the editing process a heck of a lot easier working digitally. And so, no, that I think I don't really know of another workflow since I've been doing documentary work. I really haven't tried to do anything other than what I know. What program do you use to edit? Adobe Premiere. Okay. All right. Yeah. So Wagon Masters was on Final Cut 7, which we can go into that whole thing, but Final Cut 7 is, in my opinion, the greatest editing program ever made. And then Final Cut changed things, I want to say around like, or maybe 2017, somewhere in there, to Final Cut X. And now it is, I don't use Final Cut X, so I use Premiere now, which is more akin to Final Cut 7. But don't get me down that path, man, because that's a whole can of worms. Well, I have friends who are filmmakers and video guys, and so I mean, I know some of that, and I've had some experience with it, and it's really amazing. They use more Resolve and some of those programs, and they really like that. But it's become one of those sort of things I just like to, ask people about, because my son's getting into it a little bit too. So we got like the free version of Resolve and stuff like that. So Resolve's great. That's probably the next one I work on. I'm probably going to fold in Resolve a little bit. Oh, really? Also just to teach myself. Yeah. So as you're going through the process, what are some of the things that you learned, right? So you talked about feeling honored that you were part of telling the story and you got involved. I'm sure you spent a lot of time. I'm sure you filmed who knows how many hours worth of footage and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So as you're kind of getting immersed in that world and the story, what are some of the things you feel like you learned?
Yeah. It was around 60 hours of footage, just
Okay.
FYI.
Okay.
I learned something from a filmmaking standpoint. And then I think, like most projects I work on, I'm taking something away personally. I think you have to, especially a doc filmmaker, I think that's a good part of the process to take something away personally. But from a filmmaking side, I'll say this. As a journalist, I was used to having my list of questions, having what the point of this one shoot was going to be, what the objective is. In this process, I had to throw all that out the window. I mean, I would be sitting with the artist, Christopher Holt, as he would be sketching a model in the fresco for 2, 3, 4 hours. And I would just be sitting there, hearing their stories, no agenda, just letting them talk. And that was a little bit of a different process for me, not going in with kind of this, how I'm going to direct the scene, but just kind of letting them talk and having them open up. And it worked out great. And so that was, from a filmmaking standpoint, that was kind of cool for me to do that and take that approach, hopefully in future projects. In terms of the project itself, and we were talking a little bit about this before we started, but I was raised Catholic. And so I went to church and CCD every Sunday, all growing up. When I left home and went to college, I stopped going to church, and I wasn't really sure, started to question things a little bit more. And so when I discovered this story, it kind of brought me back into that a little bit more. It kind of brought me back into the church a little bit more. And one thing that Haywood Street does, the church, Haywood Street congregation, one thing they do that really speaks to me is this idea of faith through action. I mean, the ministries that they have going on at that church are remarkable. I mean, the fresco is a ministry, but they have, the welcome table. They have a needle exchange. They have an art room. They have a clothing closet. They have a chiropractor. They have all sorts of stuff that you're like, this is wild, and that just really spoke to me. And so definitely changed how I felt about religion. And church in a certain way. And kind of, like I said, it kind of brought me back into that world a little bit.
Well, I think that's really an important point, kind of as we get into theirs is the kingdom. The title was it chosen by you? Let me just ask that question.
Yeah.
Did you choose that?
And it's kind of a nod to something that never actually explicitly makes it into the film, but the composition of the fresco was inspired by the Beatitudes. And so I felt it would be right if the title reflected that in a certain way.
Nice. Because when we talk about theirs is the kingdom and Brian, the pastor in the film, mentions this, and you and I talked about a little bit before we started, how it's a big thing with me too, about how important it was in a lot of Jesus's teachings, and I think it's throughout the rest of the New Testament too, about giving to people without expecting profit from it. Like you're just giving, you're just generous, and you're reaching out to the people who society puts to the margin or has forgotten, but they haven't been forgotten by God. And the church, if we're going to put faith in action, right, we have to somehow show that God hasn't forgotten them. And how do we do that, right? We have to get involved. We have to get dirty, as it were, like get in the midst of the mess, so that we can communicate that. And, for us in our church, we have regular things that we do with the homeless and different ministries like that, because, and doing it in a dignified way, like they were talking about in the film, about looking people in the eye. And, for years, we haven't done it the last couple of years because of COVID, but for years, I took my kids and we would do Christmas morning breakfast for the Atlanta Mission. It's
Mm-hmm.
down, and we get up super early on Christmas Day and go down there and cook breakfast and serve it. And there were a lot of people, and we would tell the people who would come down there, and for us too, like, the most important thing you can do today is sit across from somebody and treat them as a human being, and ask them their name, try to get their story, and just make a friend, and because a lot of times people think, oh, and they went over in the movie too, right? Like, it's just, oh, we just feed them. They're hungry, we feed them. And that happens, but people are more than food, right? And clothing, right? And that's Jesus too. And so I just love those elements in the movie. And I do think that you're an example of something that I believe that I think the world longs to see that reality more than they are shown oftentimes.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the reasons why I really connected with this movie, and I really connected with it. And I was even telling a couple of the pastors in our network about it this morning. And I was like, I think you guys would really like this movie. It really speaks to a lot that we talk about as far as who we reach out to and where the value is. And again, it's not necessarily the mega church model.
Yeah, right. Certainly not.
But I do think it's a Jesus model. And I think there's a reason. And I don't want to go into all of that, but I love kind of how you spoke about that. Now, when you said you learned about the process, how much of the structure for the movie, because for the movie, without giving away a lot of spoilers, but the movie does this really cool thing where, as you explore the fresco and the making of it, there are a lot of the people that were involved in the ministry, and their stories are kind of told through putting it in a more permanent sort of sense and putting it up there. And I love the dignity of that. And I love the value of that, showing the dignity and equality of everybody sort of thing and their stories. How much of the structure of you kind of weaving in, not all of them, but I think, I don't even know if a majority, but several of the characters, the people, did you already have that structure, or did the structure and the flow kind of come out of, this is what I have at the end,
Well, so originally, kind of just to pull it back one more layer, there are 30 people more or less that are depicted in the actual fresco. Good. 11 of them you learn about in the film, and they're short vignettes. A number who have been homeless and maybe now have housing, some that are still homeless, so you're kind of hearing about their stories. I knew that was always going to be a part of it, because that's kind of the power of the artwork. It's not depicting a historical scene or a biblical scene. It's depicting actual people who are living in Asheville, battling with these things.
Right.
So I knew that was always going to be a part of it. Early on, though, I thought the focus of the film was much more going to be about the creative process and the art process, and how this kind of cool piece of art comes together. And so in some of the earlier cuts, the focus was more on that.
Okay.
And then, getting some feedback and hearing some folks trying to balance that out with the model stories. That was always kind of like how much of the creative process versus, and then there's kind of two more subplots, one being Brian, the Reverend, and kind of the theology of Haywood Street and the theology of what they're trying to say with this fresco. That kind of ties it together. And then the last part really wasn't added till the very end. And those are, if you remember, kind of the news segments about Asheville and about Western North Carolina and affordable housing and cost of living and all of that type of stuff. And that was added to kind of try to expand the scope a little bit. But to your original question, always kind of going back and forth and trying to strike a balance, and, never feeling like you're totally done until you say, all right, that's the last, can't do it anymore. That's it.
Yeah.
So it was always trying to strike a balance there, but certainly initially it was going to be more art focused. And then and then it went more into the models. Yeah.
Well, and it is a very unique medium of art. I mean, the fresco, because it is so time consuming, and it has this sort of ancient element to it. And it's totally very, very cool. Now, how early did you get involved? Like, obviously you said you had heard about it, and like, how early did you get involved in the process? Like 3 years, I think they said, is how long it kind of took. Like, were you there that early?
Yeah, pretty much. I was fortunate to be there. I wrote in the grants that I applied for and things, first sketch to final unveiling. And if it wasn't the first sketch, it was one of the first 5. I mean, it was early on. And I mean, certainly the whole process of the fresco, but no, I pretty much was there for the whole art process. And so that made it really, really cool to be able to see the entire art process. And that's why initially I thought, wow, I'm going to be able to see this thing from, literal start with like pencil sketches. And then they translate that to the composition, and then they make that full size. And then they finally do the fresco painting. So there's like 2.5 years of work before they actually get to the fresco painting. And that took about 4 months. But that whole thing, I got to see, 98% of that. Which was a pretty cool process. I didn't know anything about fresco art, so I learned a lot about how you make a fresco. And one neat thing about fresco is they put down a wet plaster every day, maybe the size of, I don't know, it depends on the day, but 3 feet by 3 feet, let's say, maybe smaller, depending on how much detail. And they paint into that plaster until it's dry. It can no longer take the paint. And that's it. Like, if they don't like what they did that day, to erase it, they have to literally chip off the wall. They have to chip off the plaster. And so where that becomes pretty cool is like on the last day of painting, which you see in the film, you literally see the last brushstroke. And it's not like an oil painting where, you could touch up different corners that you painted on different days. I mean, that brushstroke was the last piece of paint that went into the fresco. So it is, first sketch to the final brushstroke, that the art, I was able to see all that, which was pretty neat.
Yeah. Well, another reason I love the movie is another one of my soapboxes is I believe that Christians should be some of the most creative people in the world. And often that's not true. And so I love that element of art was brought into it, and that's part of the dignity that you share with people is it's not just a simple kind of like it's not an obligation, maybe is the wrong word, but a simple sort of utilitarian, we're just going to feed and house somebody.
Sure.
Like that life is more than that. Life is art and wonder and mystery and all of that stuff that the arts do for us. And there's a reason why we do that, and animals don't necessarily have that, right? I mean, there's a reason why we enjoy that and look for that. And so I love that a lot of that was recaptured and kind of gone into that detail, because it was fascinating to me. So how much of the kind of sharing what was going on as far as sort of advocating for a more dignified, maybe policy towards the homeless, in that particular area, and kind of highlighting some of that, which I really appreciated. How much of that was kind of your idea, and how much of that did you talk with Brian about it as well?
Oh, no, that was all my idea. I think that was before I started showing Brian a cut of it. Like, I wanted to make sure that the ideas that I wanted to get across were sufficient enough before I sent something to say, hey, what do you think? Certainly with the folks affiliated with Haywood Street, who maybe wouldn't have been able to at least understand what a really rough cut, like I was mentioning earlier, if something really wasn't. So no, that was an idea I had near the end to try to expand the scope of it a little bit more, but also to say, like, there's a lot of parts of those segments that say, Asheville's tried 200 different strategies. That was one of the newspapers. It was 200 different strategies to deal with the homeless population, and none of them have worked. And I think kind of that idea is that this is not a solution-based film, but this is also an issue that doesn't have an easy solution. If it did, we wouldn't really be talking about this too much. I mean, this is something that is a difficult thing that has to be dealt with, in a number of different ways. And I think what the film attempts to do is not say, hey, here's the solution, but say, these are some difficult truths that we have to struggle with on a personal level. You have to think about your preconceived notions and your judgments and your day-to-day actions. And that's a potential solution, but that's maybe where we need to start. And that's certainly what Haywood Street believes. That's what this fresco advocates for. And so the film kind of follows suit with that.
Yeah. Well, and although you don't state it explicitly, I think the implication in the film, and I don't know how much you meant it to be this way. I think you probably did. Seem like a smart guy. But the implication, at least in the film, is that obviously there are going to be policies that we need to look at and do better, right? I don't want to dismiss that and say like we don't need to do that on a political whatever level. But at the same time, to see that a lot of the things that Haywood Street is doing is at least part of the solution. Humanizing people, having relationship, that a lot of the problem isn't a simple element of, again, that they don't have enough food and clothing or they don't have a job or whatever. Is something that we have learned in our ministry dealing a lot with the homeless, is that homelessness a lot of times is an issue of what we call relational poverty. Is, there was one time I lost my job, in 2008 or 9, right after the, big recession. And I lost my job and I had a family that I could go live with. Right. I mean, I was married and had 3 kids, and I wasn't out on the street because relationally there were resources available to me that may not be available to other people for whatever reason. And so that relational aspect that I saw from Haywood Street, and a lot of the testimonies and the testimonies, that's a very religious word, but a lot of the testimonies, coming from the models, the people in the saying, hey, I just showed up for a meal, but I felt loved. I felt connected. And that started them on a path of transformation. And there's a lot of other things in the movie that I really hope that people check it out, because there's a lot to what's said through the theology, for lack of a better term, and the perspective of Haywood Street it's been a big part of what we've learned too, dealing with the homeless, dealing with addicts, dealing with, one of the things they've learned about addicts is it's not a drug problem. It's a connection problem. It's a human connection problem. And so the best sort of, as we deal with, some of the best successes in those sort of addiction recovery programs, it's not as simple like just don't do drugs, right? It's, they reconnect them with what we all long for, is that relationships that we want. So I think we probably answered this question, but what do you hope that people get out of it? So you made this movie and it should be personal. And I love that you said that. And, you learn things. What do you hope that other people learn kind of as they take away stuff from this movie?
I think that any good art requires the viewer, the listener, whoever, to meet that piece halfway. All right. So whoever's watching this film, I mean, they're bringing themselves to this film as much as it's being brought to them. All right. People are going to watch this and focus specifically on one area or another area. And that's the beauty of filmmaking, is I create something and put it out into the world. And then, people come to me with ideas about it. And I think, wow, that's really great. I'm happy it resonated with you in that way. So I'll give mine, but I think it's a cool question to ask anybody. What was the point of that film? I'm curious when I hear people answer that question. So for me, I will say that kind of the thesis statement, so to say, is probably Jeanette. She's the second to last model that you meet, the African-American woman who talks about when she sees somebody who is at the church with a bag of clothes on one knee and a child on the other, that she's been there before. And she's able to relate to that person. And she talks about that because somebody says to her, she retells this story in the film, how would you know? You've never been homeless. And she says, there's not a homeless look. There's not, you may not look like you're homeless, but you are. And I think it gets to this idea that everybody is struggling with something, that we're all dealing with struggles, big and small. And I think that we should try to the best of our ability on a daily basis to withhold our judgments, to keep an open mind, to love everybody, because you don't know what people are bringing to the table on a daily basis. And if there's something that in this film that I hope somebody takes, it's that. If somebody takes something else, I'm cool with that too, because that's art. But I would just say that that's the one thing for me that I hope that all of these stories kind of symbolize that in some way, that we see a lot of times the end product, or not the end product, but certainly an outcome, somebody on the street corner. And that's all we know of that person's story, without thinking of all of the situations that led that person to get to that point. And I hope that hearing some of these stories that are pretty raw, some of them are somewhat hard to listen to even, creates a little bit more empathy in us to think, man, what that person must have been through to get to that point. So what can I do? What's my reaction? What's my response to that situation? That's what I hope.
That's great. Well, hey man, as we're kind of wrapping this up, tell people how they can watch it. It's kind of streaming now, I think. Yeah. And I know it was kind of on your website. So what are some places people can go to watch this movie?
Sure. It's on Amazon Prime. It's on Apple TV. It's on Google Play. It's on YouTube. So it's streaming in a lot of the big places people can go to watch it. If you go to theirsisthekingdomfilm.com, we have a link on our website to all of the streaming platforms. So yeah, if you just search Theirs is the Kingdom movie or Theirs is the Kingdom documentary, it'll show a list of all the places you can watch it. And you can follow us on Instagram, the obligatory social media shout out.
There you go.
At Theirs is the Kingdom. We post a lot of updates on there as well. So a lot of places to watch it. All
right. Awesome. Well, hey man, I really appreciate your time today. I know we went a little longer than I thought.
No, this was a cool conversation. And let me say one more thing. And this just when it got back to the idea of, you talked about with community and people kind of needing relationships to overcome some of these struggles. One really cool thing that Haywood Street's doing, it took them 9 years to get to this, but they finally just broke ground on, I think it's a 50-unit affordable housing apartment complex in downtown Asheville. And this is not what you would typically picture when I say affordable housing. I mean, this is marble countertops, stainless steel appliances, with a focus on community to get people who are on the streets off the streets, but then also give them a community and relationships and support, which is what a lot of times is that missing piece. And so they just broke ground on that, I want to say a month ago, and they've been working for over 9 years for it. So I wanted to just say that because it kind of relates back to what you were saying. But if anybody's in Asheville or goes through Asheville, I don't know where your listenership is here, but I would just encourage people to check out Haywood Street, see the fresco, learn about what they're doing. I think that they're doing some really remarkable things.
Awesome. Well, thanks, man. I'll put the links in the show notes and stuff like that for people so they can find it. And again, this was awesome. And I really appreciated this conversation. And like I knew it was going to be great because I watched the movie. And so if you would just kind of pray us out and just bless the people who've been listening. Thanks, man.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. God, thank you today for just getting us together, meeting like-minded people and talking about this project. And I hope that it makes people reflect on themselves and their community and what they could do for others. And if they are in the area of Asheville, to hopefully go check out Haywood Street, check out the fresco, learn more, and share this story with others. So, God, thank you for all of that. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, buddy.
Thanks a lot.